What was the last 2 days? Did you what did you
hangover?
Yeah, right. Your secret's safe with us, buddy. What did you learn over the last 2 days about LSU football? I know that obviously they have been quiet and recruiting and putting together staff and players, and they finally introduced everybody over the last 2 days. What'd you make of it?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because you know as well as I that there's probably not too much real, roster insight or things like that we really got because one, they haven't even really worked with most of these players, and two, they're not exactly going to tell us too much. But still, we did learn a good bit about how a lot of these coaches think and kind of what their plans are and what their styles are, and quite frankly, we've learned a lot of their stories, which I think hopefully will be some good pieces from the Athletic and a lot of other places over the next few weeks and months. But, I think one thing that was insightful is I think one of the biggest questions we all had was what in the world is LSU's plan at center? And of course, I'm not ruling out a transfer coming in the next few months, but it was informative that Brad Davis, offensive line coach, did tell us that, he's pretty much cross-training the entire offensive line to play different positions, including 6 different, tackles and guards trying to learn to play center right now, including, Garrett Dellinger, their highly touted tackle, and Marlon Martinez, a guy who I thought might compete for starting a job at guard. I think they have some guys that they really think they can cross-train there, and Kelly's kind of put an emphasis on Davis finding that center on the roster. So I thought that was informative, absolutely.
What's the best thing that Kelly has done, in your opinion? Not best, I don't know, that's a bad way to put it, but the most impactful thing that you think has been done by Kelly in the short time that he's been on the job?
I mean, it's the answer is probably like the most talked about, so it's not exactly going to be the most interesting, but I think the most impactful will probably end up being just the staff he's hired. The Louisiana connections, your Frank Wilson, your Cortez Hankins, even your Joe Sloan, who doesn't get talked about as much. Brad Davis. I think that's going to pay the most dividends in the long run because that was everybody's number one question with Kelly, and I think. Obviously, maybe that first sign class didn't show it, but I still do think that's answered a lot of those questions everyone has. And then of course the other thing is just the transfer portal. I think they've done, and I've said this before on the show. I give them a lot of credit for how they've attacked the portal. They didn't just aimlessly throw out scholarships. I do think they did it in a pretty disciplined way, which is impressive considering it's 13 guys. That they did factor in the right kind of guys and character guys, and they strayed away from a lot of really talented guys who, from what I understand, they were just like, hey, he has a little red flags or things like that. They're just like, that's not what we need for a rebuild. So I think they did a good job with that as well.
What did you make of Matt House, the defensive coordinator?
Yeah. We're talking. I think when he was up at his press conference, right? Like at the podium, he was a little more rigid, probably a little more nervous, right, and things like that. But then once you got him, at the table, alone in the room, he was really great. I think he's a really sharp guy who actually talked in depth about how he goes about defense and all these things, and I think he's a guy who one is pretty personable. I think more personal than he even came off in that podium session. But I think he's a guy who is going to connect with players pretty well, and I think he's just really sharp. I honestly do believe that, and he's a guy who proved how good he can be as a defensive coordinator. But then being able to then take his coordinator experience, then be an NFL linebackers coach, which is kind of an entirely different skill set, and then bring that back into being a higher level coordinator. I think that's a really, really good marriage. And yeah, they didn't really tell us what their front's going to be, but I think, and I joked on Twitter, I'm like, there's never been a coach who said I don't want to be multiple. But so I'll roll my eyes at everyone saying they want to be multiple. But what I thought was even more interesting though was the way House and others and Jamar Kane and so others talked about. It's not like they just want to be multiple. They are literally in the process of figuring out the strengths of their guys. For example, can B.J. Ojulari be a 3-4 outside linebacker? What can some of these D tackles do as more of a 3-4 DN? How versatile can they be? They're in the process of figuring that out, and then they will cater their defense to what they can do. And I say that because I think there were a lot of times the last 2 years where it was more like a mandate of this is what you are and this is what we're going to be and things like that. And I think it's literally going to be figure out what they can do and cater defense to get the best out of it.
Brian Polian as the recruiting coordinator, it was good to hear from him. How do you imagine that dynamic behind the walls working with Wilson, who, I mean, let's be honest, there's not a more dominant recruiter in the state of Louisiana than Wilson, but just the recruiting room. I don't know if you saw as well, it looks like they've released Mason Smith out of that room, so they're making changes to that side of the office, it looks like.
Yeah, I think the way I envision it working is kind of, Brian Polian is more I'm trying to think, there's no perfect comp, but more the general manager in that, if we're using that analogy, the guy who's overseeing and is still going to be doing a whole lot of recruiting, but the guy overseeing while, your Wilsons and so many others I'm not taking credit away from are the guys who may be a little bit more the guys who are just like really make these massive impacts. I think that's how it's always kind of been explained to me. Polian's the one putting the pieces in play a little bit more, thinking 5 years down the road, Matt putting the boards together along with, your Will Redmonds of the world and your J.R. Belts, of course, they're all involved in that. But I think, he's kind of more that while, Frank Wilson's your star or other guys are your stars. I think that's the best way I've always understood that dynamic. But I also give credit to Polian for going out of his way multiple times on Wednesday to kind of say like, hey, I would be foolish not to unbelievably lean on Wilson during, this, especially early, to be like, hey man, I'm not an expert on this. Why don't you, take over on this? Why don't you fill me in on your perspective? So it does, and Polian's a former, head coach. So I do think he has a good sense of how to delegate and do these things. So credit to him so far, at least.
I thought it was very positive news on what Wilson was spreading on John Emery yesterday. What do you know of Emery and what do you expect of him going into his final spring?
Yeah, I've heard just so many mixed things, but it's hard to tell what's what because, everything I had heard is that indications are he should be eligible and that he has bought in. And I know you've said the same on your show that he does seem like he's turning a corner. And honestly, I think you and I both thought he was turning a corner, mentally and kind of his discipline going into last fall. Just obviously the academic issues caught up to him. So I have heard mainly positive things, but there's also just a lot of people, I think, in that building who, if you ask them, they say something that basically alludes to like, I'm not going to get my hopes up until it's there.
Sure.
And I think that's a lot of fans, honestly, with John Emery. Just the idea that, this guy is the super talent they've been hearing about for literally 4 years now. And they're just kind of waiting for it to all come together. But everything I have heard has been mainly positive. I think a lot of people are just kind of skeptical.
Do you think that they're done shopping quarterbacks in the transfer portal?
Oh, man. I think I wouldn't put my money on another one coming, but I do not think they are not going to pursue a really good quarterback if it comes open. And at one point, Mike Denbrock was asked directly that toward the end of our session yesterday. And, he thought about it and he was like, I don't know. I mean, he's like, probably not, but, it's foolish to rule anything out. So the sense I've always gotten is, yeah, man, if Caleb Williams did text you one day and say, I want to come to LSU, you're not going to say no. But at the same time, I don't think it's an urgency, but I could be very wrong.
Where's your confidence on that position group, that room going into the season? Quarterback.
I'm curious your thoughts as well. Yeah. I think it falls in that category for me of, one, I trust Brennan. I think to some extent, he's viewed as just kind of this old veteran, but it's like, no, I mean, if anything, he's the big-armed, 370 yards a game and SEC play guy. I do have faith in him. Do I think he's going to be healthy? No, of course not yet. But I think there are far worse scenarios, and especially in LSU's last 15, 20 years, way, way worse scenarios in the past than, if Brennan doesn't work out, you're turning to a top 100 second-year quarterback who has some playing experience in Nussmeier, or maybe Walker Howard's ahead of schedule. I think it's a pretty great situation where you're marrying that stability of Brennan with the upside of some of these guys. I feel solid about it. And it sounds like, Joe Sloan and Mike Denbrock feel pretty solid about the veteran, presence of Brennan. But, until we see it, it's just hard because even though we talk about Brennan as the veteran, he's still the three guys who really have only 3 games of experience,
Sloan seems like one of a kind of a young gun on this staff. I know that he doesn't come with the Power 5 experience coming from Louisiana Tech, but it seems like his relationships are really solid within the state. And I know we won't know the dynamic of how the field works until we see him in spring, but him as the quarterback's coach, how do you think that relationship functions with Kelly, Denbrock, and that group?
Yeah, when that hire was made, I kind of quietly was like, I think that's one of the better hires in some ways, just because I think he is a coach who's really rising. I mean, he's an OC at a really respected Group of 5 school at Tech, and when that job came open, he interviewed for the head job. So I think he's a really good get there. And again, I'm not actually predicting this, but there is just that element you wonder of, okay, Denbrock's a slightly older OC, and maybe Sloan gets a chance to, kind of be a guy who can learn and develop, kind of like Tommy Reese or someone like that. Kelly does have a history of promoting. That is something he does. But to your actual question, Joe Sloan even reminded me, he was like, I actually have a relationship with Brennan going back to his recruitment, because he's been recruiting the state in this area for, that the South Mississippi area for so long. So I think he is good at relationships. He is good at those things. And I do think a lot of Joe Sloan. And we talked with Denbrock a good bit about how he views multiple voices in the room, right? And he talked about how, he wants everybody to have a say. He wants everybody to be involved. He wants everyone to have thoughts in the matter. Yeah, at the end of the day, he believes there should be one guy calling plays and it shouldn't be muddled too much. So he's going to take everyone's opinion and then make the decision. But at the same time, I do think he's very open to your Hanktons and your Sloans having a strong input.
Brody, what were your impressions of Brian Kelly?
Yeah, I think it's notable that I think it's clear he's on a mission to prove, he is a personable guy. You know what I mean? I think it's been notable through both days. He's very clearly, I'm not saying this is an insult. I mean, this is a positive too. He's trying to make jokes. He's trying to show everyone like he is kind of a fun guy, because I think so much of the narrative about him was like grumpy Brian Kelly. And by the way, there are versions of him that are absolutely that. There are stories of him these last few months of him being that, but there are also people who tell you he's incredibly personable, and all that. So I think my big takeaway through not just these last few days, but these few months is I think he's a little more personal than people give him credit for. I think he's a better recruiter, one-on-one than people maybe give him credit for. And the thing I've talked, and I want to do a bigger story on this some point down the road, but the thing I just keep hearing from every assistant I talk to, honestly from recruits I've talked to, is Brian Kelly has a plan, right? And I keep asking, like, what does that mean? Everyone's saying he has a plan. And they talk about how he's just one, and Brian Polian has been around a long time talking at length about this, about how he's the most effective communicator he's ever been around. And he is clear about what he wants, and it's tangible, and it's something you can actually handle. You know what I mean? It's not just like broad messaging. And then they talked about how he sticks to his messaging. There's a consistency day to day to day, and there's not like this variance of what the day might bring, and then all of a sudden it's chaos. No one knows where they stand. There's this very clear, effective messaging and kind of leadership that people have really raved about. Coaches are kind of like, shoot, this is really how it can be. That's kind of what I've heard so far. I'm not going to sit here and say it's going to be all sunshine and rainbows. I'm sure there's so much negative we haven't heard yet, but still, it has been the main takeaway for me these last few days.
Brody Miller, he covers LSU football. You can follow him on Twitter at Brody A. Miller. He covers it for The Athletic. Obviously, spring practice starting in a couple of weeks for LSU football. We will be talking to him a lot more over that time period. Brody, as always, thank you for the insight and time today. Enjoy the carnival. Stay safe this weekend. We'll talk soon.
Same to you. Thanks for having me as always, guys. Take care.